Jedediah Colt woke in the dark. Not the gentle dark before dawn, but the heavy, waiting dark of a house holding its breath. The floorboards under his boots gave a low groan as he moved, each step a familiar weight in the silence. He was a man made of work and sorrow. Shoulders wide as an axe handle, hands scarred from wire and wood, a face the sun had cracked into a map of lonely years. In the nearby town of Dust Haven, they called him the Giant Widower, never to his face. He didn't go to town much anymore. The whispers got old. He stopped dead in the kitchen doorway. She was there. Annie Hartwell. Standing at the table in the thin pre-dawn light, her shoulders were slumped, like she was carrying something too heavy to put down. A kettle hissed a quiet song on the stove. Coffee and simmering beans. The smells of a life trying to go on as normal. But nothing was normal. He saw the tremble in her hands. He heard the sound. A soft, hitching noise, like old fabric tearing. She was crying. Jed just stood there, a mountain of a man pinned by a sound smaller than a bird's wing. Comfort wasn't his language. His size made him feel like a bull in a china shop during moments like these. But seeing her like this, it was a splinter in his soul. Annie had only been on his ranch for 3 months, a ghost of a woman who worked from can't see to can't see. She cooked, she mended, she cleaned, all with her eyes on the floor, her words small and careful, like she was afraid of the space they took up. He cleared his throat, a rumble that was more accident than intention. Annie jumped like a spooked foal, spinning around. Her eyes were huge and wet in the gloom. Strands of pale hair stuck to her damp cheeks. She scrubbed at her face with the back of her hand, but it was too late. The proof was there. "Sorry," she whispered, the word breaking in two. "Didn't mean to." Jed lifted a hand, palm out, a gesture meant to be gentle that probably looked clumsy. "Don't apologize," he said, his voice a low growl that he tried to soften. She just stared at him, her lips parted like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. Her gaze darted to the stove, the door, the floor, anywhere but his face. Shame was rolling off her in waves you could almost see. It settled in the room like dust, thick and choking. After a long, heavy silence, she finally spoke, her voice thin and trying too hard to be steady. "You hungry?" He should have said yes, he should have let it go. But something else, something heavier, pushed the words out of his chest. "Someone hurt you?" Her breath caught in her throat. For a second, she looked like she was going to shatter right there on the floor. But she shook her head, fast, too fast. "It's nothing," she said. "Just words." He didn't have to ask whose words. He knew. Dust Haven was a small town, but it had a long memory and zero mercy, especially for a woman on her own. He'd heard the whispers when she first arrived, that she was a drifter, that it was improper, a single woman living and working under his roof. He'd ignored it, but hearing that the poison had reached her, that felt different. It felt like a fresh wound. Jed shifted his weight, the floor groaning in protest. He wasn't a man for speeches. He didn't have the words to soothe the sting of gossip, so he did the only thing he could think of. He walked further into the kitchen. Annie flinched, just a tiny movement, and then braced herself like she was expecting him to yell. Instead, he just said, "Coffee smells good." A strange sound escaped her, half a sob, half a laugh. She nodded and poured him a cup, her hands shaking so much the black liquid sloshed over the rim. He took the tin mug and pretended not to see. He leaned against the doorframe, the warmth of the coffee seeping into his calloused palms. The wind moaned outside, and somewhere far away, a storm was grumbling. He watched her from the corner of his eye. He saw how she slowly pulled herself together, straightening her spine bit by bit, smoothing her apron like she was reassembling herself. "Town folks don't know you," he said finally, his voice quiet. She glanced at him, her eyes wary. "They don't want to." "They didn't know my wife either," he said, and the old grief made his voice rough. "Didn't stop them from talking." Her gaze met his and held it for a second longer this time. A flicker of understanding, a shared hurt passed between them. Then she looked away, but the silence that followed wasn't sharp anymore. It was companionable. He thought about how damn lonely the house had been before she came. The cold dinners in silence, the rooms echoing with everything he'd lost. Annie's quiet presence had started to fill in the cracked parts of his world, and he'd given her nothing but work and wages. Maybe that was a mistake. "You cook good," he said. It was awkward, but it was honest. A tiny smile touched her lips, there and gone in a flash. "Thank you." He wanted to say more. He wanted to tell her that the bread she baked reminded him of a time when his life wasn't a ruin. That just the sound of her moving through the house had started to heal a wound he thought was permanent. But the words were too heavy. They'd come out wrong. So instead, he reached across the table and nudged a heavy sack of flour closer to her. "Heavy bag," he murmured, an unspoken offer. She blinked, surprised. "I can manage," she said, but her voice was softer now. The sun was climbing, spilling gold across the kitchen floor. Outside, the windmill creaked as the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. Annie went back to stirring the beans. Her shoulders weren't so slumped anymore. She still looked like a breeze could knock her over, but something inside her had firmed up. A little piece of her had been stitched back together. He finished his coffee and set the cup down. "If the town gives you trouble," he said, staring out the window, "you let me know." She hesitated. "I don't want to make more trouble for you." He turned then, his gaze steady. "Ain't trouble to stand by what's right." The air in the kitchen seemed to hum with the weight of that promise. Annie swallowed hard, her eyes shining again, but this time it wasn't from despair. It was something else, something warmer. She gave a small, deliberate nod. For the first time since she'd set foot on this ranch, she didn't feel completely alone. Jed left the kitchen, his boots thudding down the hall. He stood on the porch, looking out at the horizon. He could feel a storm coming, not just in the clouds, but in the way gossip moved through a place like Dusthaven. Like a prairie fire. He'd have to be ready. The thought was a heavy weight, but for once, he didn't feel like he was carrying it by himself. Inside, Annie wiped her face and stood up straight. She thought about the sneers and the whispers in town. They still hurt. But something had changed. She'd seen real kindness in the eyes of a silent, broken man, and it was a stronger shield than she could have imagined. And that's when she heard it. Hoofbeats. Faint at first, but getting closer. Annie froze, the spoon still in her hand. Jed must have heard it too, because the porch boards creaked as he moved back to the doorway. A moment ago, the horizon had been empty. Now, a lone rider was taking shape in the pale morning light, a dark silhouette moving with a slow, deliberate pace that felt like trouble. Annie's stomach twisted into a knot. She didn't know who it was, but some deep animal part of her recognized the shape of a storm long before the man's face came into view. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke loose in the afternoon. Rain came down in long silver sheets, turning the world outside the windows into a blur. Jedediah Colt stood on his porch, letting the water run off the brim of his hat. He should have been grateful for the rain. The land was thirsty, but all he felt was the heavy weight of the rider's visit. The man had come and gone, but his words lingered in the air like poison. He'd gotten close enough for Jed to recognize the horse first. A rangy sorrel with a crooked white stripe down its face and a limp in its back leg. The rider was a man named Virgil Kane. He used to be a marshal, but now he was mostly a carrier of gossip and bad news. A man from Jed's old life. The life before the grief had silenced him. "Colt," Virgil had said, his voice cutting through the rain. "Heard tell you're harboring a cook." Jed hadn't said a word. He just stood there, solid as a rock. Virgil had spit into the mud. Town's wagging its tongues. Don't take kindly to a young woman keeping house for a widower. You know how Dust Haven is. Jed's face had remained a stone mask, but something cold had ignited behind his eyes. She cooks, he'd said, his voice flat. That's all. Virgil had let out a laugh with no humor in it. That's never all, Jed, and you know it. Folks will tear apart what they can't understand. You were a legend once. The gun hand. The trail boss nobody crossed. Don't let yourself become some lonely old fool that lets rumors eat him alive. Jed had just stood there, letting the rain wash over him. He hadn't asked for the visit, but he understood the warning. Gossip was a fire, and Annie, as fragile as she seemed, would be the first to burn. Now, standing inside, dripping water onto the floorboards, he saw her face. She'd heard. He knew she had. She was trying to hide it, trying to look busy with a dish towel, but her expression was shattered. You didn't have to listen to that, Jed said quietly. I didn't mean to, she whispered. Then, before she could lose her nerve, she asked, Is it true? What they're saying? His brows drew together. What are they saying? That I shouldn't be here. That it's wrong. The words came out like she was pulling thorns from her own skin. I didn't want to cause you any trouble. Jed looked at her for a long time, water dripping from his hat. You cook. You work. Ain't nothing wrong about that. But they think. Let 'em. He cut in, his voice sharp for the first time. Then it softened. You need a roof over your head. I need someone who knows their way around a kitchen. That's the beginning and the end of it. She wanted to believe him. She really did. But the echoes of old humiliations were screaming in her ears. A man named Luther Crow. He'd promised her marriage, a future. Then he'd vanished with every cent she had, leaving her ruined in the eyes of her hometown. She had traveled halfway across the country to outrun those whispers, and here they were again, wearing new faces in a new town. Later, after the storm had passed and the sky was bruised with evening light, Jed went out to the barn. Annie watched him from the kitchen doorway. He moved among the animals with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his massive frame. He wasn't the legend Virgil Kane had talked about. He was just a man hollowed out by loss. When he came back inside, she found herself asking the question before she could stop it. Did you love her? He stopped, his hair still damp from the rain. He didn't answer for a long time. Then his voice was so low she almost didn't hear it. More than I knew how to say. Annie nodded, a tightness in her chest. I'm sorry. He looked at her then, and there was no pity in his eyes, just a strange, quiet respect. World's hard, he said. It takes things from you, leaves scars, but you're still standing. She almost smiled. Standing doesn't feel like much. It's enough, he said simply. From that day on, something shifted between them. It was in the small things. Jed started leaving little kindnesses for her to find. A wobbly chair leg fixed before she could mention it. A stack of firewood piled higher than she'd ever need. One morning, a single stubborn wildflower was sitting by her plate at the table. In return, Annie cooked with more care. She found a tear in his old coat and mended it without a word. She polished his spurs until they gleamed. They were building a bridge between them, not with words, but with quiet gestures. But the outside world wouldn't leave them be. When she had to go into town for supplies, she felt the stares like a physical touch. Women turning their backs, men letting their eyes linger a moment too long. As she was leaving the mercantile one day, she heard a woman whisper, That Hartwell girl knows more than she ought to. Poor Jedediah has no idea what he's got under his roof. The shame was a sickness she carried all the way back to the ranch. When Jed asked her what was wrong, she just shook her head. She couldn't bring herself to repeat the words. One evening, he found her sitting on the porch steps, hugging herself tight as the sun bled across the sky. Talk, he said. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. She shook her head. It doesn't matter. Matters to me. And something about his low, steady voice broke the dam inside her. The words came pouring out. All of it. Luther Crow, the town she fled, the humiliation she could never seem to outrun. I thought if I just worked hard enough, she finished, her voice cracking, I could disappear from all of it. But gossip rides faster than any horse. Jed sat down next to her, the old porch groaning under his weight. He didn't touch her. He just sat there, his presence a solid, safe wall beside her. After a long time, he spoke. Folks don't get to write the whole story. She looked at him, startled. They tried with me, too, he said, his voice dropping. After she died, they said I'd lost my mind. Said a man alone out here must be half a ghost. Maybe I am, but I still breathe, I still build, and I choose who I let get close. A knot inside her chest loosened. She'd spent so long being defined by what other people said about her, the idea of choosing for herself felt foreign. You think the town will ever stop? She asked. He shook his head slowly. No, but we don't have to. The quiet that followed was different. It wasn't empty, it was shared. But their small peace was about to be shattered. A few days later, Jed was out mending a fence line miles from the house. Annie was in the yard, hanging laundry in the breeze. That's when she saw the wagon coming down the road. The driver pulled up, a man with a crooked grin and eyes that were far too familiar. He tipped his hat. Her blood went ice cold. Annie, girl, he drawled, and the sound of his voice was a nightmare she thought she'd escaped. Luther Crow, the name hammered in her skull. He looked just the same. Slick hair, a smile full of false charm. His eyes swept over the ranch house, the fields, and his grin got sharper. Well now, looks like you landed on your feet. She took a step back, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. He took a step forward, easy as a snake. Don't look so scared, he said. I ain't here for trouble, unless you make me need it. Just figured that giant of yours might like to know who he's been feeding. Anger, hot and quick, flared up under her fear. Leave, she managed to say. He just chuckled. I'll be back, when he's here. A man ought to know exactly what kind of woman he's got warming his bed. He tipped his hat again and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust rising behind him like a ghost. Annie stood there, frozen, long after he was gone. The world felt like it was closing in on her. All the strength she had so carefully rebuilt was turning to dust in her hands. Luther was here. The past she had prayed was dead and buried was standing on her doorstep. When Jed came home, she would have to tell him. She would have to choose between silence and the fire, and either choice felt like it would burn her alive. The rain-soaked mud was still clinging to her skirt the next morning when she had to ride into Dust Haven. The flour was gone, and Jed was out on the far edge of the property, wrestling with a broken fence. She didn't want to go. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, but they needed supplies. The town's single street felt a mile long. The windows of the shops seemed like eyes, watching her every move. The bell over the mercantile door sounded like a death knell. Mr. Haskins, the man behind the counter, gave her a smile that was all teeth. Morning, Miss Hartwell. It was polite, but his wife, standing behind him, whispered something sharp and ugly. Annie didn't hear the words, but she felt the sting. She tried to focus on the list in her hand. Flour, beans, salt, but the whispers followed her down the aisle. Poor Jedediah, taking in strays. She'll bleed him dry and be gone by spring. That kind of woman always lands on her feet. Each word was a tiny, poisoned dart. When she paid and turned to leave, 2 women were blocking the doorway, their heads together, their voices low but not low enough. All alone out there with him, night after night. It's shameful. Annie's throat closed up, but she forced herself to walk past them, her back straight, even as her stomach churned. The ride home was a blur. She told herself they were just words. But she knew better. Words could hollow out a person's life until there was nothing left. She remembered the town she'd fled after Luther betrayed her. Neighbors who used to greet her now crossing the street to avoid her. The empty space around her in the church pew. She hadn't just left a place. She'd run for her life. And now, the hunt was on again. Jed was waiting for her when she got back, his shirt dark with sweat. He took one look at her face as she climbed down from the wagon, and his eyes narrowed. They said something. It wasn't a question. She opened her mouth to deny it, to say it was fine. But the lie wouldn't come. Same as before, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Only louder. His jaw clenched. He looked past her, toward the town, a place he couldn't see but whose poison could reach them all the same. You ain't done them any harm. That's never mattered, she whispered back. That night, Jed barely touched his dinner. He just sat at the table, his big hands folded, staring at nothing. He was so still, it was like watching a mountain think. Annie cleaned up around him, the air thick with the decision she could feel him making. Later, when she was in her small room, she heard a sound from the main house. A slow, deliberate sound. The click and slide of metal on metal. He was cleaning his rifle. The next day dawned hot and bright. The kind of day where everything looks sharp and dangerous. Annie was hanging laundry when she heard them. Hoofbeats. The sound she'd been dreading. Luther Crow rode into the yard, that same crooked smile plastered on his face. But this time, he wasn't alone. He had 2 other men with him, both of them rough-looking and mean. Well now, Luther drawled, swinging down from his horse. If it ain't my sweet Annie. She froze, her hand still clutching a damp sheet. You need to leave. Leave? He laughed, a low, nasty sound. Not before I say a proper hello. It's been a long road from Kansas City, hasn't it? His men chuckled. One of them spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. Just then, Jed stepped out of the barn. He moved with a calm that was more terrifying than any rage. He was wiping his hands on an old rag, his eyes taking in the whole scene in one slow, sweeping glance. You're trespassing. Luther just tipped his hat in a mocking gesture. Just visiting an old friend, heard she was working in your kitchen, figured you'd want to know about the kind of woman you've been feeding. Jed's face was unreadable, but the air around him crackled. You've said your piece. Luther's grin got wider, uglier. Oh, you don't care that she's ruined? That she left me with nothing but a pile of lies? A man like you, Colt, a man with a reputation. I figured you'd want the truth. Annie's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. He's lying, she said, her voice shaking but fierce. He's the one who took everything from me. Luther threw his hands up in mock surrender. There she goes again. Jed took one step forward. Just one. It was as deliberate as a tree falling. Mount up, he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the ground. Now. For a second, Luther actually hesitated. He'd known of Jed Colt in the old days. He knew the stories. The man who was feared on every cattle trail from here to the border. He looked at Jed now, the set of his shoulders, the slow, even breath, the dead stillness in his eyes that promised nothing but violence. Luther's smile flickered. Then it hardened again. You think you can scare me? The whole town already thinks she's trash. It won't take much for me to finish what I started. Jed's eyes were like chips of flint. His fingers brushed the rag in his hand, but he didn't reach for the gun on his hip. Leave, he repeated. The word was softer this time, and 100 times more deadly. One of Luther's men shifted in his saddle. Boss, he muttered. Luther spat in the dirt, his eyes darting between Jed and Annie. Then he swung himself back onto his horse. This ain't over, he snarled, yanking on the reins. They galloped off, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the air long after they were gone. Annie let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, her whole body trembling. Jed didn't move until the riders were just specks on the horizon. Only then did he speak. "He hurt you bad." She could only nod, unable to make a sound. "I won't let him again." It wasn't a fancy promise. It wasn't shouted in anger. It was just a statement of fact, delivered with the weight of a mountain. And something inside Annie, something that had been broken for a very long time, cracked open at the sound. That night, the ranch was a fortress, waiting for a siege. Jed worked late in the barn. Annie watched the flicker of his lantern through the cracks in the wooden walls. She saw him oiling his rifle, checking the action on his revolver. He moved with a quiet purpose that both terrified her and made her feel safer than she had in years. He wasn't a man who looked for a fight, but he was a man who would finish one. When he finally came inside, he didn't say much, but as he passed her room on the way to his own, he paused. "He'll be back," he said. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Will we be ready?" His eyes met hers in the dim light, dark and certain. "We will." After he was gone, Annie sat in the dark, her heart fluttering like a caged bird. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But for the first time, she felt something else alongside it. A fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the one place she wouldn't have to run from. She looked out the window at the dark land, the stars like sharp points of ice in the black sky. She didn't see the shadow far down the road, half hidden in the mesquite. A lone rider, the tiny red glow of his cigarette, a single watchful eye in the darkness. Luther hadn't gone far at all. Thunder was rolling in from the west, a low, angry grumble that vibrated through the floorboards. The sky was turning a bruised purple. Jedediah Colt sat on his porch, the rhythmic scrape of a whetstone on steel, the only sound besides the groaning windmill. Each stroke of the stone across his old hunting knife was slow, patient, and full of deadly intent. Inside, Annie was stirring a pot of stew she had no appetite for. The clatter of the spoon against the iron pot was a nervous tick she couldn't control. The air tasted like rain and electricity. She kept glancing at the door, as if she could will it to stay shut, will the world to stay away. But she knew. Quiet time was over. Men like Luther Crow didn't just ride away. Jed was on his feet before the sound of the hoofbeats even reached the house. He set the knife and stone aside and picked up his rifle, his hands as steady as if they were carved from granite. "Stay inside," he said. The words weren't harsh, but they were final. Annie's throat went dry. "Jed?" He turned to look at her, and in the flickering lantern light, she saw something in his face she'd never seen before. The grief was still there, etched into the lines around his eyes, but it was overlaid with a fierce primal protectiveness. "I won't let him take another piece of you." The words hit her harder than a physical blow. She nodded, her hands trembling, and watched from the doorway as he stepped out onto the porch. The rain started then, first as a whisper, then as a downpour. By the time Luther rode into the yard, it was a solid wall of water. The lantern light sliced through the darkness, catching the slicker on his back and the ugly grin on his face. The two men from before were with him, their shapes dark and menacing in the storm. "Well, if it ain't the giant," Luther shouted over the roar of the rain, swinging off his horse. He was holding a rifle, loose and ready. "You got my woman hiding in there, Colt?" "She's not yours," Jed said, his voice as low and steady as the thunder. Luther laughed, a sound as sharp and mean as broken glass. "The town seems to think different. They say you're keeping a ruined girl out here like some kind of prize. I say she owes me, one way or another." Annie flinched as the word ruined hit her. Jed took a half step forward, his massive frame seeming to soak up the darkness. His rifle was angled down, but it was ready. "Leave!" One of Luther's men snorted. "We ain't scared of no ghost stories, old man." The other one looked nervous, his eyes darting from Jed to the dark windows of the house. Luther's grin faded into a sneer. Big man, lonely heart. Maybe you forgot how things work. Gossip's a fire, Colt. It burns a whole lot faster than you can put it out. I'll light the match, and she'll be nothing but ash. Jed didn't move. He didn't even blink. The silence from him was so absolute, so heavy, it felt like the rain itself had stopped to listen. Then he spoke, his voice a dead calm in the heart of the storm. You try it. You'll choke on your own smoke. A bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in a brilliant, ghostly white. For a single frozen moment, every face was a stark mask of hate and fear. Then Luther swung his rifle up. But Jed was faster. The crack of his rifle was sharp and clean. It wasn't a panicked shot. It was deliberate, precise. Luther's hat flew off his head, a neat hole punched right through the brim. Luther's men cursed, their horses rearing in terror. You got teeth after all, old man, Luther snarled, and fired back. The bullet splintered the porch railing, inches from Jed's leg. Annie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Jed's second shot was even faster than the first. It kicked up mud right at the feet of one of Luther's men, who yelped and scrambled for cover behind the water trough. The other one had seen enough. He wheeled his horse around and bolted, disappearing back into the storm. Only Luther was left, his face a twisted mess of rage and disbelief. You can't win this! He screamed, his voice cracking. The town's already on my side! Jed took another slow step forward, a relentless force of nature. His rifle never wavered. Then let them watch. Another flash of lightning lit him up. Soaked to the bone, scarred, and absolutely unshakable. The legend Virgil Caine had spoken of wasn't dead. It had just been sleeping, and Luther Crow had just kicked it awake. Luther hesitated. From the doorway, Annie saw the exact moment his bluster broke. He fired one more wild, desperate shot that went nowhere near Jed. Jed didn't flinch. His return shot cracked through the night and tore straight through the sleeve of Luther's coat, spinning him halfway around. Luther cried out, clutching his arm, the raw fear finally naked on his face. The rain hammered down, a relentless drumbeat on the roof, on the mud, on the two men left standing. Jed lowered his rifle just an inch. Leave, he said, his voice carrying over the storm, while you still can. Luther stared at him, his chest heaving, rain plastering his hair to his skull. Then, with a wounded snarl, he stumbled back to his horse and hauled himself into the saddle. He and the man cowering behind the trough fled into the darkness, swallowed by the storm. Jed stood there until the sound of their hoofbeats was gone. Only then did he turn back to the house. Annie was still in the doorway, framed by the warm lamplight, her hand braced against the wood to keep from falling. Her face was pale, but her eyes were wide with something that went beyond fear. He stepped back onto the porch, a thin trickle of blood running from a graze on his shoulder where the railing had splintered. You hurt? He asked quietly. She shook her head. You? He glanced at the wound as if he was just now noticing it. It's nothing that won't mend. For a long moment, they just stood there, the rain cooling the air, the storm's fury slowly moving off into the distance. Annie felt her own heart start to slow down, replaced by a fierce, soaring feeling she couldn't name. It was safety. It was awe. It was watching a good, quiet man stand like a mountain for her. Inside, she helped him clean the cut. Their fingers brushed, a brief, electric touch. Neither of them spoke. Words would have been too small for what had just happened. As the thunder rolled away, leaving the night feeling washed clean, Annie knew that something had changed forever. The gossip would still be there, but the story had a new ending now. The town of Dust Haven would hear about this night. Luther Crow had tried to light a fire, and he'd run into a man who wouldn't burn. But as Jed sat heavily in his chair, his eyes drifted to the dark window. The storm had passed, but storms have a way of circling back, and a man as full of pride and poison as Luther Crow was never truly gone. He was just waiting. The morning after the storm was soft and quiet. The whole world smelled clean. Jedediah Colt was up before the sun, the graze on his shoulder a dull ache he ignored. Annie found him on the porch, already hammering a new piece of wood into the space where Luther's bullet had shattered the railing. His movements were sure and steady, each strike of the hammer a declaration. He was repairing more than just a porch. He was refusing to let the violence of the night before leave a scar on their home. She watched him for a long time, this giant, quiet man, choosing to build instead of break. It stirred something deep inside her. She brought him a mug of coffee. He took it with a nod. No words were needed. The days that followed were filled with a fragile, unspoken peace. Luther Crow didn't come back. A traveling peddler brought the news that Crow was holed up in town, his arm in a sling and his pride in tatters. And a funny thing started to happen to the gossip. The whispers didn't stop, but they changed their tune. There was a new edge to them, a little bit of fear, a little bit of respect. Dust Haven had seen its quiet giant finally stand up, and they weren't so eager to poke the bear anymore. Annie felt the shift most keenly the next time she went for supplies. Mr. Haskins gave her a curt nod, but his wife didn't whisper. The two boys who used to snicker behind their hands now tipped their hats as she passed. She walked out of the mercantile feeling lighter, as if a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying had been lifted. Back at the ranch, life settled into a new rhythm. Jed insisted on finishing the fence line, despite her protests about his shoulder. She ended up out there with him, holding the posts steady while he hammered. Mud splashed onto her dress, and to her own surprise, she laughed. A real, honest laugh. Jed stopped hammering and just looked at her, a quiet warmth in his eyes, as if he'd forgotten what the sound was like. Their silent dinners weren't so silent anymore. The spaces between their words were no longer filled with loneliness, but with a comfortable understanding. He started bringing her things from the prairie, a strangely shaped rock, a sprig of wild sage, an eagle feather. She started leaving a fresh-baked pie to cool on the windowsill for him when he came in from the fields. They were small things, but they were building a life, one quiet gesture at a time. One evening, she brought him his old coat, the one that was torn and frayed. She'd spent hours mending it, her stitches neat and strong. "Figured it could use a second life," she said softly. He ran his rough fingers over the seams. "I ain't used to gifts," he said, his voice gruff. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He looked at her then, a long, searching look, and in his dark eyes, she saw something she'd never seen before. Gratitude. Hope. It felt like taking her first real breath after years of holding it. It felt like coming home. The land itself seemed to feel the change. Spring arrived, stubborn and beautiful, pushing wildflowers up through the hard, dry earth. Jed built her a new kitchen table, solid and smooth, big enough for a family. Annie planted flowers by the porch steps, tiny spots of color against the weathered gray wood. Together, without ever saying it, they were turning a lonely refuge into a home. But peace, as Annie knew too well, is a fragile thing. One afternoon, with the sky burning like a hot copper pan, she saw a rider coming down the road. Her heart leaped into her throat, the old fear a cold, familiar hand. Jed came to stand beside her, the rifle leaning against the wall, close, but not too close. It wasn't Luther. It was Virgil Kane, the former marshal, his tarnished star still pinned to his vest. He swung down from his horse, his eyes taking in everything: the mended rail, the new flowers, the woman standing beside the giant. "Word is you ran Crow off," Virgil said, his voice flat. Jed didn't answer. Virgil's gaze shifted to Annie. It was softer this time. "Town's talking different these days. Seems they finally figured out which side of the fence the snakes are on." He paused, chewing on the inside of his cheek. "But a man like Crow, his pride is a sickness, I don't reckon he'll stay gone for good. Annie swallowed, but she didn't look away. Jed shifted his weight, a subtle movement that brought him a little closer to her. Virgil saw it and nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. You two be ready. The world doesn't like to let folks climb out of the holes it digs for them. And with that, he got back on his horse and rode away. The silence he left behind was heavy. You think he's right? Annie asked, her voice small. Jed kept his eyes on the empty road. Maybe. But if Crow comes back, he won't find us the same. She looked at him then, at the quiet strength in his face, and she realized what he'd said. Us. Not you. Not me. Us. The word settled between them, a promise stronger than steel. That night, the lantern light from their little house was a warm beacon in the vast, dark prairie. It no longer felt like a place of exile. It felt like a kingdom they had built for themselves. Later, with the stars scattered like diamonds across the black velvet sky, Annie stepped out onto the porch alone. The cool night air felt good on her face. She thought about the girl she used to be, the one who had run from shame and whispers. That girl was gone. The woman standing here now was made of stronger stuff. Jed appeared in the doorway, a silent shadow. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The way he looked at her said everything. She walked over and stood beside him, their shoulders just barely touching. Somewhere out in the darkness, a lone coyote sang its defiant song, and for the first time, Annie felt like she knew what it was singing about. Slowly, deliberately, Jed reached out and took her hand. His hand was warm and calloused, and it fit around hers perfectly. There were no grand speeches, no fancy declarations, just the solid, unshakable weight of his hand in hers, telling her, without words, that she was finally, truly, safe. And in that one, simple, perfect moment, the long war against gossip and shame and fear was over. The storm had passed, and all that was left was the clear sky, the quiet land, and the thrilling, terrifying, wonderful knowledge that she was home. What they didn't know was that their peace was built on borrowed time, because hundreds of miles away, in a dusty, forgotten corner of the territory, a telegraph message was clicking its way across the wires. A message from Virgil Kane to a federal marshal in Kansas City. It contained only 2 words: found him. The man it referred to wasn't Luther Crow. Virgil's visit hadn't been a warning, it had been a confirmation, and the storm he was bringing had nothing to do with gossip. It had to do with a 15-year-old warrant for murder. And the name on that warrant was Jedediah Colt. The peace that settled over the ranch was so complete, it felt like a dream. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The summer sun baked the land, and the wildflowers Annie had planted thrived. She and Jed fell into a rhythm that was as natural as breathing. They worked side by side, ate side by side, and sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the stars come out, their hands intertwined. They were 2 broken pieces that had somehow, against all odds, made each other whole. The town of Dust Haven left them alone. The whispers had died out, replaced by a grudging respect. Jedediah Colt was no longer the town's lonely ghost. He was the man who had faced down trouble and won. One afternoon, Virgil Kane rode into their yard again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him were 4 men, all wearing the grim, determined look of the law. Annie's heart seized with a familiar terror. She thought they were for Luther. Jed stepped onto the porch, placing himself in front of her. His face was calm, but his eyes were hard. "Virgil," he said, his voice a low warning. Virgil didn't look at him. He looked at Annie. "Ma'am, I think it's best you go inside." "What is this?" Annie demanded, her voice shaking. "Jedediah Colt," Virgil said, his voice formal and cold. "I have a warrant for your arrest, for the murder of Deputy Frank Miller in Kansas City, 15 years ago." The world stopped. Annie stared at Jed, her mind refusing to understand the words. Murder? This man? This gentle, quiet man who mended fences and brought her wildflowers? It was impossible. "You've made a mistake," she said. Jed didn't move. He didn't speak. He just kept looking at Virgil, and in his eyes Annie saw something that broke her heart. Resignation. It was true. "Jed," she whispered. He finally looked at her, and the pain in his face was a raw, open wound. "Annie, Don't," Virgil cut in. "Colt, you know how this goes. Don't make it hard." Two of the deputies dismounted, their hands on their pistols. Jed slowly raised his hands. He didn't fight. He didn't argue. He just let them put the irons on his wrists, his shoulders slumping in a way she'd never seen before. He looked defeated. As they led him away, he looked back at her one last time. "I'm sorry," he mouthed. And then he was gone, a prisoner on his way to hang, and Annie was left standing alone on the porch of the home they had built, the world they had created shattered into a million pieces around her. The silence that fell over the ranch was a crushing weight. The house was no longer a home. It was just an empty box full of ghosts. Annie wandered through the rooms, touching the things he had built, the coat she had mended, trying to reconcile the man she knew with the murderer they said he was. She couldn't. It didn't make sense. The days blurred into a haze of grief and confusion. The town started whispering again, but this time, the whispers were laced with a dark, morbid excitement. They had always known there was something wrong with the giant widower. Then, a letter arrived. It was from a town she'd never heard of, 100 miles away. It was postmarked before Jed's arrest. It was from his late wife's sister. The woman wrote that she had heard about Annie, that she was glad Jedediah wasn't alone anymore. And then she wrote a line that made Annie's blood run cold. "I hope he has finally found peace. He carried such a terrible burden after Frank's death, always blaming himself for not being able to protect him. Frank, Deputy Frank Miller, Jed's brother-in-law." It all clicked into place. The grief, the self-imposed exile, the silence. He wasn't a murderer. He was a man drowning in guilt. He hadn't killed Frank Miller. He had been with him when he was killed and had blamed himself ever since. He hadn't been running from the law. He had been running from a ghost. Annie saddled a horse, her hands moving with a desperate purpose. She had to get to him. She had to make them listen. She rode like the devil was on her heels, the letter clutched in her hand. She found him in a jail cell in the territorial capital, looking like a caged bear. When he saw her, his face crumbled. "Annie, you shouldn't be here." "You didn't do it," she said, pressing the letter against the bars. "Jed, you have to tell them what happened." He just shook his head, his eyes full of a pain so deep it was bottomless. "It doesn't matter. I was there. I should have saved him. It's my fault." "That's not justice, Jed. That's guilt. Don't let them hang you for a crime you didn't commit." But it was no use. He had already condemned himself 15 years ago. He was ready to pay the price. Defeated, Annie left the jail, tears streaming down her face. As she stood on the street, lost and hopeless, a man tipped his hat to her. It was Virgil Kane. "I figured you'd show up," he said. "He won't listen," she sobbed. "He's going to let them hang him." Virgil looked at the jail, his face grim. "I know. He's the most stubborn, honorable fool I've ever met." He looked back at her, a strange light in his eyes. "But maybe he'll listen to the man who was actually there." And that's when he told her. Virgil had been a young deputy back then with Frank Miller. They had cornered a gang of outlaws. Jedediah, who was just a trail boss at the time, had been there, trying to help his brother-in-law. Things went bad. Frank was killed in the crossfire. In the chaos, the real killer escaped. Jed, devastated, had carried Frank's body out of the fray, and the only witness who saw it just saw Jed standing over the body with a gun in his hand. That witness was Luther Crow. It was all a lie. A 15-year-old lie that had festered and grown. Luther had used it to get away with murder, and Jed had let him, consumed by his own grief. Virgil had been hunting the truth ever since. He'd tracked Luther to Dust Haven. He'd used the old warrant to get Jed out of the way, hoping to spook Luther into making a mistake. And it had worked. With Jed gone, Luther had gotten bold. He'd been bragging in the saloon, telling everyone how he was finally going to take over the Colt Ranch. And he'd let something slip, something only the killer would know. Virgil had him. They went back to the jail, Virgil and Annie, and told Jed everything. For the first time, the heavy weight of guilt began to lift from his shoulders. The truth, after all those years, was finally setting him free. The charges were dropped. Jedediah Colt walked out of that jail a free man, blinking in the sunlight as if seeing the world for the first time. He looked at Annie, his eyes full of a love and gratitude so powerful it took her breath away. He took her hand, and this time, he didn't let go. They rode back to Dust Haven together. When they arrived, the whole town was gathered in the street. Luther Crow was in the center of it all, in chains, Virgil Kane standing beside him. The town was silent, their faces a mixture of shock and shame. They had been so quick to judge, so quick to believe the worst. As Jed and Annie rode past, people looked down, unable to meet their eyes. They didn't stop. They just kept riding, leaving the town and its whispers behind them. Back on the porch of their ranch, with the sun setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jed pulled Annie into his arms. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered into her hair. "You never will," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "We write our own story now." The long war was finally over. The ghosts had been laid to rest. And in the quiet, windswept corner of the world, two lonely souls had found not just a home, but a future. They had faced down lies, gossip, and the demons of the past, and had come out the other side, stronger and more in love than they ever thought possible. Their story wasn't just about survival, it was about redemption. If you enjoyed this story of justice and a love that refused to be broken, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales of the Old West that you won't want to miss.